I am incredibly honored to be able to have on the podcast Alvin Hall. Alvin has done so many interesting things. He's an art collector, he's an author, he's a podcast broadcaster, he's a broadcaster, and he's written over 20 books. He is a financial educator and he has such an interesting background. He grew up as the oldest of seven children in a subsistence farm in a little tiny county outside of Tallahassee. It was a village of 52 people. Once a month, his mother would go to town to get flour, corn, sugar, and coffee. But everything else the family ate, they caught naturally or grew themselves. Alvin has performed so many interesting live shows. He performed with the Moth in a storytelling show, Beyond My Viewmaster's Dreams. He's got one of the most valuable or important art collections of African American art that has been heralded, and he's written a number of his books. I think he's authored maybe 23, 24 books, but a number of them on money and the importance of savings, and those have been acclaimed. He's also written a children's book. So very, very interesting man. But the primary driver for this is I was able to read his latest book, Driving the Green Book, which some of you may have seen the movie, The Green Book. I did and was profoundly affected by it. Alvin, thank you so much for being on. I can't wait to hear more about you and your story. So I would love if you would start with a little more context around your background and how did a young boy from such a small village get to Bowdoin, and talk about that path a little bit.
Well, I was raised in segregation, and I was raised, as many Black children were during that time, completely or largely removed from the effects of segregation because our parents were so protective. One of the things that people don't understand about Black communities and Black parents is that they really act as shields for their children. And I was one of those children, and my entire family was, where we were raised in this very protective, loving environment, although we had no money. However, I was the child who always dreamed. So when we would go to town and they'd give us like a nickel or 10 cents to spend, I would go to the back of the Macquarie store and look at the Viewmaster slides, and I would buy one based on the cities. And these were old-fashioned names like, Siam and Constantinople and places like that. And I would create this entire dream world based on these slides. And I think that really fed my imagination. So when the integration occurred in the county in 1968, 69, I moved from the all-Black school to the white school. And there I discovered a whole different world. But the good thing about that was that my grades did not slip. I continued to do very, very well. And then I was accepted to a program called Project Upward Bound, which is still around today. And a lady there, Mrs. Freddie Grooms, recognized that I had something in me as this curious little boy who was from this farm, who had never seen a movie, who had never eaten at a restaurant or anything like that. And she recommended me to her friend, Dr. Joel Fleischman, who was running a program called Yale Summer High School. And I was accepted to that program. And to this day, I say, on the day I stepped on that Eastern Airlines plane to fly to New York City to take the taxi from LaGuardia to Branford College at Yale, that started the transformation of me. It changed my whole life because all of a sudden I was a kid who knew all of the trees in the neighborhood. I could walk all that land. I knew the river down the road. But after going to Yale, I discovered there were lands beyond that, rivers and seas beyond that I could actually try to get to.
Yeah, you were a sponge, and you needed a bigger sponge, right? I mean, you just continue to absorb all the information you got. It gives me chills because my wife and I started a program called the Dallas Urban Debate Alliance. There are programs all over, but part of what it does is it provides support for our inner city public schools to afford policy debate experience to these kids. And a number of them who have not traveled, they may not have grown up on a farm with 52 people in their village, but they haven't traveled. They get to go to these debate camps as a part of the program, and just to hear that story from the stark, going from segregation to integration to Yale, it's so fascinating. So why is it important to tell the stories of Driving the Green Book? What's the relevance for today?
I think that these stories that people had growing up in these communities, segregated communities, servicing or patronizing these businesses there, sharing their on the road experiences, will give today's youth an understanding of their parents' and grandparents' behavior. Any Black person who travels will wonder, why do my parents want to get on the road at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning? Why are they always packing food? Why do they only want to stop at these kind of places? This history has been passed on. And I think that as young people read these stories, they'll understand that the history they're experiencing today, the world that they're experiencing today, is connected to this history. It may not be in obvious ways, but it's there. The other thing that I think is really important is that people need to reflect that just because somebody has a set of values or a perspective that you don't have, sit down, talk to them, read about their experiences, and you will understand what they mean. There's a brilliant story in the book that I frequently think about. And it's of this family who is driving around Nashville, and the family, who is very successful, has a son and daughter in the car, and the grandmother in the car. And as they're driving through Bellevue, she's saying, "Why are we here? Why are we here? We need to leave here. Why are we here?" And as they drive on to look at the houses and everything, she becomes more and more anxious. Why? Because she remembers a time when they had to be out of that neighborhood by sunset. And so for her, it's not a joy to drive around and look at the beautiful lawns and the houses. It induces anxiety. And I think these types of stories in the book will help people understand the previous generation's emotional responses to certain contemporary situations.
It's so beautiful. And one of the things, there's so many topics I want to touch on, but one of the things that strikes me in who you are and what I've seen of you online, and it'd be impossible for me to have seen everything, but you have love in your heart. What keeps you from being resentful? I mean, first explain the sundown law. These were laws, right, in certain places. And how do you keep from being resentful of the past and the people who did create these laws during Jim Crow time that were based on race?
Your question could not be more timely. Yesterday, I was in Washington, D.C. at the Congressional Black Caucuses Conference. And there I met a guy named Mondale Robinson. And he's from a small town called Edenton, which used to be a sundown town. And he is now the Black mayor of a former sundown town. It is this moment of transition. And we talked about the richness of this moment, how our parents raised us to be open to everyone, not to be trapped by fear, and most importantly, not to be trapped by other people's bad reactions toward us. I was raised, I admit this, in a very fundamentalist world. And the key thing that my parents said again and again and again is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I really live by that. I don't say it as a joke or something funny. I actually live by that. And I think you can't hold people hostage to things that have occurred in the past. You can make them responsible for it. You can ask them to talk about it, but you cannot stop the dialogue with them because of that. The dialogue has to remain open. And I feel very lucky that my parents gave me this freedom by shielding me from so much of the bad things that were going on in the world when I was a child. I went off to Yale completely open to whatever life had ahead of me, and I've remained that way.
And the car, as you write about in the book, is freedom, right? Back then, the ability for Black people to drive around the United States was a form of freedom that they had not had. It was a liberation from the tiny geographic world, at least, that they were in. Talk a little bit about why driving was so important during that time to learn and expose yourself to the world.
When Black people took public transportation during that time, if it was the bus, you had to sit at the back of the bus. We had so many stories that we heard along this road trip of people getting kicked off a bus in the middle of nowhere at night. That was a risk. When you took the train, you sat in the car right behind the coal car, right behind the engine. So you were blasted with smoke all the time. So any type of public transportation, you ran the risk of being degraded. You ran the risk of being confronted. So once you were able to afford your own car, you were the master of your own ship. You could get to work when you wanted to. You could go out at night and not have to worry about public transportation. And equally important, when you drove, you could plan your trip so that you avoided the sundown towns where you could not be at night. You could avoid the gas stations who would not sell to you. You could drive through those towns and find the safe havens, which were listed in the Green Book, where you would be welcomed and you would receive the services that you want. So think about this. For a generation of African Americans who had migrated from the rural South up to the North, and they were able to afford their first car, to be able to get on a turnpike or a wide open road and just drive and feel the breeze, it was freedom because you knew you were heading in the direction where you wanted to go, and you did not have to be told to get off or get out.
Yeah. And you've got that great James Baldwin quote about the journey. You start the book with that. Talk a little bit about that and why it inspired you.
Yes, a journey is called that because when you start the journey, you don't know what you will discover along the journey or what the journey will do to you. Oh, Greg, when we started this trip to produce Driving the Green Book, the concept was that we would drive from Detroit to New Orleans, stopping at cities listed in the Green Book along the way where people had migrated from to Detroit. We were highly aware that all of those people who moved to Detroit had to eventually go back to the South to see mama or grandmama, to visit a grave, for church services, for a wedding. They went back. All along the trip, we would meet people. And at some point during almost every interview, somebody would say to me, "Where are you from?" I said, Wakulla County, Florida. They would go, "Yeah, you sound just like my Uncle Aubrey James, or you sound just like my Uncle Louis. I knew you were from the South, and oh my God, it's so great to talk to you. And I have this story for you. If you just have the time." I always had the time. And at every location, somebody would tell a story or a memory. So at the end of this 2021-mile trip, I didn't have a travel log anymore. I had all of these heartfelt stories of people's lived experiences, their families driving into a white suburb in Detroit and being stopped by the police. 3 young girls sitting in the back seat being stopped by the police. They find their uncle's gun and puts it to his uncle's head and clicks it 3 times. Those are the types of, and we have the funny story where the gas station says to the young woman driving south, "Girl, how you doing? And how's the cotton down south?" And she looked at him and said, "The same way you left it." Right. And so you have those kind of funny stories. And I think for people to hear these stories is very important. But how this affected me, and this is the part of James Baldwin quote that I think about literally weekly. This journey has helped me to hear stories of other people more clearly. I have immense room, no matter how busy I am, for an older person who wants to talk to me and tell me a story about their lives and their experiences. But even for young people who have stories to tell, I can sit and listen patiently because what it did, all of these stories made me aware that perhaps, as my cousin Tanya Williams says in Wakulla County, I was put on this earth to hear the stories and then to write about these stories.
Yeah, well, you've done a fabulous job of that. I mean, what I thought of when I was reading this is it's akin to the Spielberg Shoah project. You know, it's taking pieces of history that will die away and putting them there for everyone to benefit and learn from. It's just beautiful. So you touched on a point which struck me, and I kind of knew it, but I don't think a lot of people do, that the Green Book was not just written for Jim Crow South. The Green Book was written in part as a response to the Great Migration, and so it covered the North. Talk a little bit about the conception that, you know, these were just problems in the South, not the North, and you know, the history of the book itself.
Yes, the Green Book was started in 1936 and it was published until 1967. It came about because Victor and Alma Green, hence it's called the Green Book, named after them, would travel to Richmond, Virginia to visit Alma's relatives. And on the way, they experienced, quote, aggravations, unquote, and frustrations. Those were his words for the experience. And eventually, Victor, being an entrepreneur, saw an opportunity here. So he canvassed all of his friends who travel around New England and got the names of places where they could stay, buy food, buy gas, get their cars repaired, have their hair done, perhaps buy a suit if they needed it, and restaurants. All of this was included in the early publication. It was a small little pamphlet-like publication. But over time it grew, and eventually by the 1938 edition, it was started to grow west of the Mississippi. So it provided a lot of services. In many ways, this book is the first recorded history of the breadth of Black entrepreneurship in America, when during segregation and Jim Crow, you could not get the services. But when many people did that great migration from the rural South to the North, they thought they were going to the land of milk and honey, where all discrimination would be substantially less. But what they discovered in the North was that it was much more subtle, but equally pervasive and deep. We've heard so many stories about where, yes, you could go into that Irish bar, but when you finish your drink, the bartender would break your glass right in front of you, so that nobody else could drink out of the glass. A lot of Black people could not get jobs, only lowly jobs in the North because of discrimination. And you could drive to many of these places, but once you got there, you couldn't find the place to stay up north. So the Green Book covered the North and the South and the East and the West. Because of this, I did a documentary called Driving the Green Book on Long Island. Some friends of mine and I who are in the movie industry, we decided that we got a grant, a small grant for $3,000, and then we threw in some other money, and we decided to shoot this documentary, Driving the Green Book on Long Island. Long Island was one of the most segregated places in America, in many ways equivalent to the South. And for me, the revelation was that many of the immigrants who came over to America, World War I, World War II, embraced these practices in America because it gave them access to capital. It enabled them to buy their first houses. And some of them didn't think about it, but some of them knew about it, but looked the other way because they were getting theirs and they didn't care about what happened. So it has really been an eye-opening experience for us to to look at many of the institutions in the North and to look at the history of many of these cities and how they were equally as segregated as the South, but it just was more subtle. And for many people, this created a bitterness because they felt really betrayed by the American dream.
Yeah. I mean, it's Isabel Wilkerson is a favorite author of mine. And I think, I saw some of the themes repeated as well in your work that, we think, okay, well, we fixed that problem, right? I mean, we've emancipated the slaves, or civil rights legislation or whatever. But when you really dive into the history, you realize that the culture changes far more slowly than the laws do.
Hearts and minds change much, much more slowly. When we were doing the research for the Drive in the Green Book on Long Island documentary, we met this historian who's going to tell us the history of this town. And it was so interesting. He had agreed to be on the film, and he talked about how the fact that Black people didn't know how to apply for loans at banks, that Black people from the South were ignorant to the ways of financial development at the South, in Long Island. And I just thought, does he really believe this? He really did. He really did. And in the end, when he recognized what we were going to ask him about, he withdrew. But he holds on to those beliefs today. So I think a lot more people than we imagine still think these things, although there's evidence that none of it is true. But somehow this has become a part of their perspective on America and how to achieve a certain success in America, that you have to embrace these ideals.
Yeah, you have altered in such a beautiful way the storytelling a little bit, or added a valuable contribution to the storytelling, so people have the full history. So important. Were there heroes? I think you touch on this in the beginning of the book, that worked with the Greens to make sure this book could get published and distributed. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, this is one of my favorite stories. At my very first talk about the book at the Museum of Art and Design in New York City, a young man came up to me and said, "Oh, I want to introduce myself." I can't even remember his name now because there were so many people around, but it was his father who had a printing press on 7th Avenue that printed the Green Book for Victor and Alma Green. Now, Victor and Alma were told they could not tell who printed the book for them because there would have been retribution toward the printer. But his grandfather had printed the book. In order to get the information, Victor was a postman in Hackensack, New Jersey. So at the time, there was a Black Postmen's Union and a White Postmen's Union. And in a town like Baltimore, for example, that divide was absolute. Black men didn't deliver, for example, mail in white neighborhoods in many cases. So, but Victor, being smart, Victor in New Jersey was a member of the White Postmen's Union. So he was able to gather information about Black businesses in several of these places, and that became a feeder for the listings in the Green Book. Now, how did he distribute the Green Book? Well, you could order it by mail, you could buy it from newsstands. It turns out that in New Orleans, I've met somebody who had a newsstand who would get it and he would sell it out of the newsstand. But also the Pullman porters were a part of the distribution and information network. He would give it to the Pullman porters, who would then take it on the train to the local market, give it to the newsstand, and the Pullman porters would give him information about businesses he should solicit for listing in the Green Book. What's most amazing about this, Craig, is that the larger society was completely blind to this. Why? Because of segregation. One of the parts of segregation that young people in particular don't understand is that the effect is out of sight, out of mind. So therefore, those people over there, that group over there, you don't have to worry about them. They're segregated. We don't care about what's going on in that community. But Victor and Alma, as well as everybody who listed in the Green Book, was able to take the situation and create a network, some word of mouth, some reflected in the Green Book, that sustain Black people, that enable them to create their own road toward the American dream.
So interesting. So interesting. So as you think about where we are as a society today, what is your taking the lessons that you've learned from being a person who's supremely curious of other people's viewpoints, and it feels like we've stopped talking to each other. We're in camps, and we see different news. We see, we don't have these conversations. What is your prayer or hope for America or the world? How do we get past this period where now the information we're getting seems to be segregated? It seems to be following the theme that you're talking about. Talk about that.
Recently, I did a program for BBC World Service called Alvin Hall's Other America. And essentially, it's probably the most personal program I've ever done, because I thought I need to go back to this small village where I grew up, which votes largely right. The Black population is about 15%. Many of them don't vote. And I had to go back there to talk to people about what are the values that are important to them. And I think that a lot of people are afraid to talk to people with different points of views. For example, when I was trying to get some of my former white classmates to let me talk to them, I could not even get them to return my phone call. I know where they live. I know the businesses that they own in the county. I go to those businesses when I'm back there, but I think they're afraid to talk to people with a different point of view. Perhaps they're afraid you're going to yell at them. Perhaps they're afraid you're going to bring up something that's uncomfortable. But I think in order for us to move forward, we have to have these difficult but polite conversations. But I think what has happened is that people have become so hardened in their points of view, and you can now use the internet and live in a total silo where all you're hearing every day is the same rhetoric back and forth, and the same voices repeating the same misinformation, and that becomes your world. And even in a religious environment, which is what I experience when I go home, I find this to be true. People need to stop and just look at the person in front of them and try to talk to the human being, the person who is your fellow human on this earth, and connect to them. Treat this person the way you would want to be treated if you were in their position. I think so many people have lost the ability to empathize with others, to see others as human beings. We have been cultivated to believe there is an other. And once you get to the point of seeing everything different from you as an other, it's always bad. I'm always encouraging people, even people who I do not share the same political views with, let's just talk. No yelling, no screaming, and let's just see how we can communicate. But I find that there's a lot of resistance.
It's the Viewmaster discs, right? It's the keep a curiosity for everybody's background, everybody's history, everybody's story, and through that we can develop an empathy. I'm reminded of the debates during the Inquisition, and Hillel is arguing with the Pope, I believe, or his bishop, cardinal, and well, what is your religion? It's so complicated. He says, well, it's do unto others as you would have done unto you. The rest is just commentary. And isn't that the truth? I've been doing this a while now, but I think my third podcast, if I'm not mistaken, was with Professor Song Richardson, who's the first woman of color dean of a top 30 law school in the United States. And her passion, she was the daughter of a Korean, her description, tiger mom, and a black father. And she studied race anxiety. And it was, we had the podcast maybe just a couple of months after the George Floyd murder. And her whole point was not to demonize the police officers involved, but to explain that when you are dealing with somebody you're uncomfortable with, your brain works way faster than it does if you're comfortable with somebody. It's kind of your point on we're not comfortable having these conversations. Talk a little bit about how do you prepare, for somebody who's like, I really do want to learn more about people who are different from me, but I'm nervous about it. I feel stupid. What do you tell people to prepare to be in a position to have an open heart and open mind?
People like to talk about themselves. You always open the conversation by being curious about the other person. You don't have to talk about yourself. And at some point, you will find a commonality. And that commonality is the first entry point to a connection with that person. Continue talking about that person and their lives, what they've done, their children, their family, and find those connection points. Once you find that, you can expand and start to build the conversation. But you can't start by, I'm going to tell you what to do, right? You can't tell me what to do. You have to have a conversation that is much more nuanced and full of curiosity, because people love to talk about themselves.
Yeah. No, they do. That's a great point. I mean, it's why I love doing the podcast. I find, there's so many different perspectives. By the way, I do remember, and you talk about some of these, and maybe I should ask you about this, but the Song Richardson talked about driving across America. Now she's younger, but she drove across America with an Asian mom and a black dad, and they would keep a coffee can in the back seat to avoid having to stop for the restroom. Tell folks who may not get a chance to read it, I hope they do, because there's so many rich stories, but talk about some of the accommodations that Black people would use to be safe as they drove the Green Book.
The most famous accommodation is the shoebox lunch or the shoebox dinner, where on the night before the trip, all of the women would get together and fry the chicken and make tea cakes and muffins and deviled eggs without any mayonnaise, and put ice in the cooler and drinks in the cooler. And when everybody was on the road, you didn't stop for food because there were shoe boxes that contained all the food that people want. People talked about that all the time. Other people would have urinals, small little urinals like the ones they have in the hospital, but they were different back then. And they would have those in the car so that the young children did not have to go to the bathroom. Or before they left home, people would go around in the communities and collect the names of the service station, and most of them happened to be Exxon service station, where they could stop and buy gas. And you may ask, why Exxon? Because Exxon was owned by the Rockefeller family, and they had been abolitionists. And so it was the first of the large gasoline companies that would allow Black people to own franchises. There was no requirement that you serviced Black people, but you were more than likely to find at least somewhat welcoming service at those. So Black people would wait and wait and wait until they got to those. Last night, I was talking to a lady in Washington, D.C., and she was talking about how nasty the bathrooms were. So in many cases, you'd have to carry a sheet with you, so stop alongside the road, and everybody would go out and road and hang the sheets up so the ladies could go to the bathroom and have their privacy right in the woods, right beside the road, because you couldn't use bathroom. There were all those types of accommodations that Black people did. And one of my personal favorites is that Black people bought big cars as an accommodation. When you know that you can't have your children stop and sleep someplace. You're going to buy a big car with a bench seat so those kids can spread out on that back seat and go to sleep as you and your wife or you and your brother or sister drive that big car. And you wanted a car with a lot of horsepower so that if you had to get away from a sheriff, and there have been lots of stories we heard about that, you could gun that car and just go and save your family from being harassed by the police. So there were lots of accommodations. And people tell these stories, by the way, some tell them recalling the incidents with fear, but many of them tell these stories with such humor and such delight about daddy getting away from the policeman, or the deliciousness of the fried chicken and the shoebox meal. All of those are the songs they would sing on the road trip. How the mother would have them recite Bible verses to keep them distracted as the time passed. Oh, some of these stories are just fantastic.
That's so good. Yeah. And some are in the book, which I commend again. Billboard Jackson, that story, his legacy.
Yes, Billboard Jackson he changed the industry because he was working for an advertising magazine mostly focused on the movie industry. And then he came in to help Black people learn how to market themselves. And he belonged to a fraternity which now gives an annual award in his honor. Billboard Jackson is one of those figures in American culture who helped change Black life, who helped opened up Black gasoline franchises. He worked for Exxon for so many years, helping young Black entrepreneurs who want to have their own service station to have those skills. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. And you may not accept this, but you've done the same. I mean, your focus, as I learned more about you, is to, some people, the metaphor is you get to the top and you pull the ladder up. You have thrown down hundreds of ladders to people so they can get up, and you had a big focus on financial literacy. Why? And talk about some of the themes that you're trying to address and help young people to better understand finance.
Anytime I talk about my career in personal finance, I have to talk about the wonder of the people in the UK, because this whole career came about because a young man I met at a gallery in the UK offered me an opportunity to audition for television out of the blue. I did, and that led to me having a career and developing the first reality show about personal finance in the United Kingdom. And I have taken that skill set and continued to expand it. I was on the first financial literacy committee at the New York Stock Exchange many years ago. I believe that money is hardwired to our self-worth, to our identity, and to our aspirations. We may not admit that at first, but eventually it has to be true. So understanding money enables you to better manage yourself and achieve the ambitions that you want. So I try to help people understand the basics of money, that you need to always have savings because it is a safety net. I was raised without that, but yet I, being a farm boy, was practical enough to know you always have to save and you can control yourself. You don't need to have all of these things. Choose what you want. Choose the thing that will give you the satisfaction, but always put money aside, because ultimately you have to be your own best financial friend. That's key. And recognize what are your triggers. For many years, Craig, I realized that August, I would tend to buy more clothes in August than any other month. Why? Because being raised poor, that was when the clothing that my mother put on layaway at the stores would come home and we could wear it because school was about to start, right? And I would go out in August and the sales and I would buy all the stuff. And I realized that in August, I don't shop anymore. I just simply avoid it because I recognized that that was a trigger for me. You have to understand those things about yourself. So part of my outreach, whether it's my children's book, Show Me the Money, or my book, Your Money or Your Life, is to help people not only understand the basic arithmetic and simple mathematics of money, but also to understand their emotional relationship with money. Because if you can control that, you can achieve the right thing with the numbers.
Yeah, it's the psychology of money. In fact, Morgan Housel, of course, wrote that very book, the Wall Street Journal author. And I love those concepts. And it's frankly no different than the shoebox. You know, what are you doing? You're preparing for the worst. Why are you getting a car with bench seats? To prepare for the eventuality that you may not be able to get into a hotel. You know, the concept of preparing for a rainy day, and then to have to deal with your own anxieties. I mean, Eckhart Tolle wrote about that story. I can't remember in which of his books, but he talked about the woman when he moved. He gave up everything and moved to the United States, and he was in a apartment complex with a Jewish woman. She was just, thought that, the Nazis were coming for her because she'd gotten a letter that she said was to evict her. And he looked at the letter, and it was just a note that said you owe like $10 for trash collection. Yeah. But it triggered her, right? And disconnecting yourself from those triggers, like you're talking about in August shopping, is exactly what we have to do with money, because there's a lot baked into money. 2-3 days ago, Sunday, just to mark this. So we're taking this recording on September 13th, 2024, and it'll be produced in a few weeks. But on Sunday, Tyreek Hill, the wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins, is pulled over on his way to the game by officers of color. He kind of doesn't roll his window down. He kind of talks back to the police officers, but then he's violently pulled out. He's thrown onto the ground. He's knee in the back, a harsh reminder of George Floyd. What do we do here? How can we bridge with the same curiosity and love that you approach everything? How can we get to a place where driving while Black or driving while being a person of color is not a thing?
I think in that particular situation, you had two things operating at the same time. You had egos and you had fear. And the combination was not good for both parties. And the officers clearly overstepped the line in how they treated him, but he also created a fearful situation which escalated, and everybody lost control in that situation, especially the officers. I think it's hard for people when they are in a fearful situation to pull back and de-escalate. I think those skills have to be taught to people in authority when the situation is clearly not threatening. Maybe we all have to learn a lesson that my grandmother once said to me, that in some situations, you have to recognize that the only tool you have is yourself, and how to control yourself so that the situation does not get out of hand. It's not always possible in these encounters with the police or on the road. I think it will be quite a number of years until within various police departments around the country that the type of sensitivity training is put in place so that the community begins to trust.
Yeah.
Because it is that intersection or that clash of distrust of the police, tone of voice, and a sense of being threatened by both parties, from both parties' points of view, that leads to these situations. I think of this all the time. I sometimes wonder if this is part of my dislike for driving, because I really don't like to drive. I drive when I have to, but I really don't like it. I also think I'm a bad driver. But but that's a different issue. But
You
I
live in New York, everybody's a bad driver.
exactly. But, but I often think that in these situations, which they've happened to relatives of mine, where they've been stopped by the police, and it's led to sort of these confrontations. But you're having somebody, a lot of police officers are view their authority as absolute.
Yeah.
They want to put you in your place. And if you are a person who has a very strong ego, that's somebody's going to have to de-escalate. And I think people need to think of it that way.
It's so well said. And I mean, one thing I really liked about, athletes sometimes when they get the podium, they disappoint me. I'll put it that way. Some don't, some do. Tyreek Hill, I thought said something very interesting. He said, I have police officers in my family and I called them and they gave me advice akin to the advice that you're giving, that you have to always be thinking about it from the police officer's perspective as well. Dallas, Texas, a week before, there was a police officer, brand new police officer, executed basically by somebody. I mean, it's a dangerous job, and we have to be mindful of both perspectives. Again, it is why I love your work so much, because what you're doing is trying to expose people to just learning about a different perspective.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful theme. So I've got a few last questions for you, but before I ask those last few questions, I'm going to ask you for a seminal book that affects you. I'm going to ask you for a mentor you had, but what I want to ask you first is your art collection. I could see a little bit of it, and I would love to see more of it. Talk a little bit about your art collection, because it is so recognized, and how did you, tie that thread together? Financial literacy, learning about the history of our society in the United States, and art. Pull that together for me.
I think you can put it under one umbrella. I went to a liberal arts school, Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, and I had to take many different courses. And in those courses, you learn different ways of thinking and writing. So when you took an art course, you learned one way to write. When you took a math course, you learned a different way to write. When you took an economics course. And so what I learned during that period of time was a certain elasticity in my thinking. And I think everything in my life came about because I'm like a liberal arts student who didn't choose a major. I decided life was going to be my major, so I'm going to be interested in everything that comes along that's very satisfying. Art started out because of a quirk of mine. I don't like to spend money on posters. I just don't. And so I thought if I save up enough money, I can buy real art. And so I would save and buy. Some galleries would let me pay for it over time. And I would go out and look. And I started to spend time on weekends going to museums, looking at art, educating my eye, reading magazines, meeting people, talking to people about art. And over time, I discovered that I really did have a pretty good understanding of it. And I started to know what was good about works by new artists in particular. I'm very interested in the art created by living people, not by dead people. I appreciate art by dead people. I certainly go to museums when I travel around the world to see everything, but I'm particularly interested in art that's about our time, about the issues related to us. So that's what I primarily collect. And I did not collect initially with any other idea than the fact that I wanted art that would not become wallpaper in my house. I did not buy pretty paintings. I did not. I bought art that every time you looked at it, it would make you think. It would spark some new idea, and it would grow and change as I grew and changed. So that's how I started collecting. And now I'm at a point where I really don't need much new art, but I still go out and look. And every once in a while, I'll find a distinct piece by a living artist that just has such deep resonance. And I give myself a 48-hour cool down period. So if I see it, I like it, I might put it on hold, but I don't buy it immediately. I do not, because, as I call it, art lust can lead you down paths of financial difficulty, and I have been there. And so I wait. So that's I enjoy doing that. So art lust can lead you down this path, but I remain very curious about the world at large. So I read a lot of magazines, I read a lot of newspapers, I read online sometimes, probably less than I typically do, because I don't like for information to be fed to me. I like to be able to research different points of view. And so that's kept me always coming up with new ideas. Part of what I say is I sit in this apartment typically on early in the week on a Monday or Tuesday, and I think of ideas and I write them down in a notebook. And then a couple of weeks later, I look at them and think, oh, maybe I can develop that into something. So it's about having this sort of elasticity in the way that I think about things.
I think elasticity is one of the best metaphors for how we need, to have longevity in every way. And, one of the things that strikes me is one of the themes that I pulled together from researching you without being fed was that you constantly want to broaden your horizon, that you're not afraid to hear any idea, any concept, any fact. I mean, I think it's just beautiful. Really
And I
do.
don't fear failure because
Yeah.
we're all going to fail at something. You can't be successful at everything.
Yeah.
Sometimes you fail. There's this great line, this great song by Donnie McClurkin. And the lyric is, we fall down, but we get up. A saint is just a sinner who fell down and got up. And so I believe, yes, you're going to trip and fall. But my grandmother used to say, when things go bad, you can cry while you're taking the bath. When you get out of that bathtub and you dry yourself off, focus on the future.
Wash it off.
Wash
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
I think we have to be looking forward, and I mean, what do people remember about these highly anxious road trips in some ways, the taste of the fried chicken or the time together telling stories or even repeating Bible verses you may not have wanted to do in the moment. I can hear the kids going, I don't want to do Bible verses, but that's what we remember. Okay. You are a huge reader, and I love to give people a pointer or two of a book, a recommendation where they could grow. Give me one that you consider like your gemstone book, where you might have read it a long time ago, but it spiderwebbed for you and led you into a lot of different areas. And then what's a current book that you just have found that recently that you think is special?
I love Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. I've given that book to many, many people, and I've read it 4 times. I think it is a powerful book of a story of the Great Migration that is just rich, and it's eye-opening, and it's moving, and it's haunting, and it's so strong. That book lives inside of me. Very much like the stories of my own book. And I've been to see her talk about this book 3 or 4 times, and I'm never bored, never bored. The book that I read most often is called The Price of the Ticket, a group of essays by James Baldwin. I love that book. I first read Go Tell It on the Mountain in 1969, years after it was published, and it changed my world. That was the first book in which I saw myself. I connected with the character. I understood the religious background. I understood the internal wars of the main character. I knew that book, and that book was about me. It so propelled me as a writer and a person who wanted to capture that in myself. But later in life, when I got the collected essays, The Price of the Ticket, wow, those essays and the way he writes, the turn of phrases that he uses, you can open that book up to any essay and you find it is timeless in how it talks about America, how it talks about Black aspiration, and how it talks about life.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I think it's poetry. It's so put together. I just attended the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for the first time in Cleveland. I was up there with my boys, and I connect with my youngest child on music and books. Books are harder to connect with your kids on because they don't have time to read it. You know, you hear the right, they don't have time to read it. But with music, and it's that kind of poetry that I look forward to reading that. I have not read the short stories. Well, I think we should stop it there only because of time. I have enjoyed this so very much. I think that you are an inspiration and a gift to this world. You help to broadcast concepts and themes that are digestible to people. I hope they take the opportunity to take advantage of them. And I know I've recommended Driving the Green Book to so many people, and I've recommended your podcast to so many people. But thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be on with me today. I hope to meet you in person one day soon. I admire you from afar, obviously. So thanks, and good luck with your next project.
Thank you. I admire you. Thank you for having me on. And I'm happy to come back again and continue this conversation because I know that spiritually, you and I are connected. We have just met the first time, but the questions and the way you ask them and the way you frame them tells me that we're spiritually connected. So I'm happy to come back to talk to you and to explore this and other topics.
Thank you. I'll take you up on that offer, and I will reach out when I'm in your area. And if you get down to Dallas or Park City, Utah, I will be glad to open my home.
Thank you. I appreciate it.